I am a psychologist here in Houston. I've specialized in working in the field of autism spectrum disorders and other neurodevelopmental disorders for about 20 years. I've worked in educational, clinical, all sorts of different environments. I also, just as a brief introduction, have the experience of being a parent as well. My middle son is on the autism spectrum, and I get to live the realities of what that means as well. I don't share that with all the groups that I speak to, but I think with this particular group, it does add a little bit of flavor to the things I'm about to talk to you about. So I've been asked by Judy and by Mary Jane to do kind of a brief introduction to autism. I think that most people in here know that term. Most people in here have some idea of what that means. But there is also a lot of misinformation, and there is a lot of information out there that I think needs to be simplified or kind of clarified. So I'm going to start with some of the basics. I apologize if some of this is too simple or something you've already seen before, but I do think it's important to make sure that we're all on the same page when we talk about what these things mean. So, let me see if I can bring this over here so I don't have to keep turning around. Is that okay? Perfect. Do I have a link? We'll do like this. Okay. Autism spectrum disorder, also called autism, also called ASD, is a complex neurobiological disorder. And I say that because it's important to differentiate between what is a behavioral disorder and what is a neurodevelopmental or organic disorder. It is a different way that the brain operates. We see these effects in all sorts of areas. Of course, those areas include the communication aspect, social interactions, imaginative play processes, and of course, the restriction of activities and interests. So they tend to have a narrower range of interests, and sometimes they are engaged in some repetitive behavior. Again, I understand this is pretty basic stuff from the beginning, but I want to make sure that we're just being really clear about these. So when I say it's not a behavior disorder, when you're in the general public, when you're talking to people who don't come to events like this, who don't talk specifically on this topic, they may have a very clear idea in their head about what it means to have autism. Unfortunately, that image is probably dictated by popular media. If you're over a certain age, your image was like mine was for many years, and it was Dustin Hoffman and Rain Man. That was my idea in my head. Of course, that's a very, very narrow piece of what that is. Nowadays, I do get more people that identify with Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory and some of those other things, which I think adds some depth to the image that we have. But I think it's very interesting. Now, I say that because we do have things that we consider kind of characteristic or hallmark features of autism spectrum disorder. Not to say that it is a behavioral disorder, but that there are some things that we can notice. And I put these on here. Sometimes we start to see some of these difficult, awkward, rigid types of patterns of behavior, and that can be an indicator that, that you're looking at something that's consistent with autism. I'm not going to want to read all of these slides. You have these, and again, if you didn't see that on the little pop-up on your table, there's a QR code that can help you download these handouts. I won't have time. Judy's already holding up the sign telling me to slow down. We do this over and over again. I've spoken for her a number of times. Part of the reason I talk quickly is because I find this stuff exciting and interesting. Part of the reason is that I have more information in my slides than I'm going to have time to go over. And so take this information, look at it afterwards. My email address is at the end of the slideshow. Feel free to reach out and email me at my private practice. We can have the conversation continued after this. But I just want to make sure that I can get through as much of this as I can. Okay, so the term autism, and this has gone through some changes. It's been several years now, but I still think there's some confusion over the diagnostic categories. What we now call autism spectrum disorder used to be broken up in a handful of different diagnoses. All right, autistic disorder, Asperger syndrome, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. There was something for many years called childhood disintegrative disorder. That's kind of out of the book now because we actually know what the genetic cause for that is, and so it goes into a different category. And then the final category is also no longer in the book. That's something different. But those terms, you might hear autism, you might hear autistic, you might hear Asperger's, you might hear ASPI, you might hear that PDD or PDD-NOS. It's all been lumped together in one diagnostic category now, which is an incredibly confusing thing to explain to someone who maybe is on the higher functioning or the older end. And now they are told things like, your diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome doesn't exist anymore. That's going to be a difficult conversation to have. So it's important for us to understand what these mean and why those were grouped together. I'm going to go back to this for just a minute. So the reason that we did this is because there was so much confusion between where the lines between each of these smaller categories were that we were having some real trouble getting some consistency in the field in terms of diagnosis. You might go to one professional and they might call something Asperger's. You might go to a different professional with the same child and they might call it autism or something different. The idea of simplifying the diagnostic category was really to help aid us in professionals. It had gotten to the point where if I had a client come into my office with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, that told me exactly nothing about that child. I didn't know that child's level of language functioning. I didn't know that child's level of intellectual functioning. I didn't know that child's level of adaptive functioning. I didn't really have much information that would help me know what this child needed from me as a professional. The new system adds qualifiers. So you may have heard people refer to level 1, 2, and 3. I don't usually use that personally myself because I find it much more descriptive to talk about this is the area where they need support. Maybe they have an accompanying language disorder or they have an accompanying intellectual disability. Those are some things that really can provide some useful information to professionals. But it's important to understand that all of those terms still exist. You can still use the term autism. You can still even talk about Asperger's or Aspies in some circles. And people generally know what you're talking about, but the official technical diagnosis is now for all of those groups, autism spectrum disorder. There is one other category that you may see come by on a diagnostic report or something that you see for your children, and that is the social communication disorder. I will tell you that for most of the professionals in the field, we tend not to favor this disorder, and the primary reason is it doesn't help you. We can give you this diagnosis, and with in most cases, insurance companies will not reimburse for various treatments when we give this diagnosis. There are some exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, if we're trying to help families get access to services, this diagnosis doesn't help. But it is out there and it is something that you may see from time to time. Okay, so these are some interesting statistics. I'm going to go through these quickly. These actually just came out this month, the newest CDC numbers. And the CDC does this every couple of years. They release an updated number. And the way that they do this study is they have 11 sites all over the United States, and they pick a specific age. Now they've picked 8-year-olds, and the reason they picked that age is by the age of 7, statistically, most, not all, most children with autism are going to be identified by about the age of 7. That's kind of what the research has been telling us. So they pick 8-year-olds, and they count what percentage of those 8-year-olds at these 11 sites qualify for a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. I see people are kind of taking some pictures and taking note of this. 1 in 36. That number has gone down so steadily throughout my career. When I started doing this work, the number I first learned was 1 in 250, then 1 in 200, then 1 in 150. Then more recently it was 65 or 50. We just continue breaking it down, and every time this number comes out, it becomes more and more common. It's important to stop and think about that. 1 in 36 children. That's basically 1 in every public school classroom. Right? Is that the experience that you guys had growing up in school? Did you remember there being one kid that had that kind of neurological difference? It wasn't true in my school. At least I didn't know it was at the time. I think is probably the important thing to know. So we do know that ASD affects boys a little bit more often than girls. And we do notice that it is often identified less in minority groups. Now, interestingly, in this most recent released study, those gaps have been closing a little bit, which tells me a couple of things. That tells me probably that we're getting better at identifying people that would normally have not been identified, and we're getting access to services for people that maybe didn't have the access to services previously, which I think is great. It is really important to take, I put a little bullet point at the bottom, it probably should have been the biggest point. 46, or about half of the children that were tested in this group had average or above average IQ. That number statistic, that statistic is significant. Half of people have an average or above average IQ. That's the same as the general population. So a lot of people associate autism spectrum disorder with intellectual disability, and the research says that's not necessarily true. Not to say that there aren't individuals, just like in any other population, who do also have that diagnosis, but it is something to know that they don't necessarily go together, and that's a common misunderstanding that many people who aren't in this field may make. I highlighted this because this is an old statistic and I wasn't able to find an updated one, so it's a little bit older. But if you see that, this was based on, I think it was the 1 in 56 or 1 in 64 statistic. But more common than diabetes, AIDS, cancer, cerebral palsy, cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, and Down syndrome combined. If that doesn't hit pretty hard, this is going to be everywhere. All right. So for most people here, I imagine you have gone through the diagnosis process, but not everyone has. And I want to make sure that it's clear how people can access these services. Right? Typically, this starts with a concern from a pediatrician, concern from a parent, concern from a teacher, concern from someone that works with this child. And they might notice that something's different. They may notice some behavioral patterns that are unusual. They may notice that they're having difficulty learning in social domains or things like that. So it's important to understand that we start with an area of concern, and we start to evaluate this person. We start to say, are these differences within the realm, what I've heard referred to as the wide range of normal? You know, there's a lot of, we have people that are, oh, I hear the volume coming up louder. Is that better? Everyone able to hear me okay? Okay. We are able to identify some of these concerns, and sometimes it doesn't qualify for a diagnosis, and sometimes it does. That's why you need to have a qualified mental health professional that does this type of an evaluation. Typically, there's going to be some direct evaluation with the child. They'll be doing some testing. They'll ask certain sorts of questions. They'll hopefully put them into different social situations and observe how they react in those situations. And then we'll also ask for some information from outside that session. Often we like to get teachers' input. We like to get parents' input. We like to fill out different forms and things like that along the way. All right, I'm going to try and go through these relatively quickly because we could talk all day about this, and I know that there's some other important speakers we need to get to. But people ask me all the time, why the increase? What is causing all of this increase in autism? There's a number of causes. Now, it's important to differentiate between causes and risk factors. I hope that everybody understands the difference between those things, but I'm going to make it a little bit clearer if I can. Obviously, a cause is something that without that being present, you would need to have this to create the diagnosis. If you didn't have this, the cause, if you didn't have that variable, it wouldn't be there. A risk factor, on the other hand, is something that simply increases statistically the likelihood in the general population. And so that's not necessarily causal. We don't even know what that relationship is, but we do know that more people that have these risk factors are more likely to have a diagnosis of autism. So we do understand that there are some genetic causes. And the researchers have continued, if you watch the news, if you set up a Google alert for the news on autism, you're going to find new risk factors that are found about once a month. We're constantly finding new risk factors. We're finding new things that we know might increase the likelihood of somebody having autism. I have to say again, this doesn't mean that these are causal, right? It doesn't mean that you should spend your entire life trying to avoid certain temptations or certain things that are going to increase that likelihood. However, it is important to understand and to be aware of some of these things. For example, the paternal and maternal age at conception. The older a family is, the more likely that child is to have autism. Is that because of their age? We don't know, but they are correlated in some way. Okay. Now, it's interesting when people ask me, why do we have more autism diagnosed now than we did before? Well, we do know that maternal and paternal age are both increasing, where people are waiting longer to have kids today than they did 50 years ago. So that could be one of the variables. There have been some studies linking infections and inflammation during pregnancy. Spacing between births. If births are too close together, it increases the likelihood. So there have been some studies that look at things like folic acid or iron deficiencies in pregnancy, early damage to the cerebellum. There's a couple of different things. We're not even sure which toxins, but I'm just listing these as some things that might be involved. And again, I have to say it one more time, risk factors are not causes, but it is something to be aware of. I could spend, again, a lot of time talking about this, and I'm not a genetics expert, but I have been working very hard to start to understand this idea of epigenetics. And basically, the idea of epigenetics is we all have our genes, our genetic makeup and our DNA that describes and defines kind of how our bodies are built and how we're put together. Epigenetics is the study that there's actually a level of complexity that's bigger than that. It's not just building blocks that are assembled to make a simple shape. It's more like a series of light switches that our genetic code can be activated or deactivated with different environmental or situational stimuli. So as we start to understand this a little bit better, we're learning that this is why you might be able to have two twins where one gets diagnosed with autism and one does not. They have the same genetic makeup if they're identical, but there may be something that flips certain switches in one child that they didn't flip in the other. But again, fascinating research being done here that we do understand that there are some genetic influences, but it is certainly not causal that if one person has autism, then they're going to have children with autism. And we can talk a little bit more about future directions for research, but again, we've really started to find some differences in the biomedical field that we're starting to identify. These are more likely to increase the chances that someone has autism. All right, I would not be doing my due diligence as a professional in the field if I didn't touch on this subject. It's never popular, but I'm going to do it anyway. I can just say at point blank, vaccines do not cause autism. Luckily, that idea is finally dying out a little bit. I'm not hearing that quite as much, but I do still get the question from time to time. Now, I have all sorts of hypotheses, and I'll be happy to visit with you during the break about what those hypotheses are, about why those two things ever got linked in the first place. But the fact is that the science doesn't bear out. It just simply is not true that that's true. In fact, the best study that I have found is a meta study, which means they were looking. It was researchers who read other researchers' research, and they looked at all the things that they could find. In total included 1.2 million children looking at vaccines and autism. And in fact, what they found is if you did get the vaccines, you were actually just a few % less likely to be diagnosed with autism, not more. Okay, so the next part of this discussion is what are we actually looking for? When I talked about how it's not a behavioral disorder, I also recognize that there are certain things that we may be able to identify. Something must hold this group together, right? As the famous saying goes, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, because they're all so unique and different, just like any other population. However, for us to use this label, this description, we need to be able to include all of those people. What is it that sets them apart? What is it that we use to identify them? And that's what I'm hoping to identify in these next few slides. Definitely we're seeing differences in the social communication. We're seeing social interaction skills that are different in some way. Sometimes one of the things that I think makes autism such an interesting field is that you can have differences in either direction. You can have kids who are more withdrawn, who maybe don't engage as frequently or as easily with social partners. You might have kids who have never met a stranger. They run up to every person they see and they hug them and they talk and they visit with them. They may not recognize the social differences, but it is certainly a difference in their social communication. They might have difficulty starting interactions, or if they don't have difficulty starting interactions, they may have difficulty starting them appropriately, or terminating them in a reasonable amount of time. Sometimes we see reduced enjoyment sharing. That's a rather technical term from the research, and I think it's important to put that in there because it's the key word there is not reduced enjoyment. It's not that these folks don't require or want just as much connection with other people as anyone else. It's sometimes they show it slightly differently. And so it may be that we don't recognize or we don't see the ways that they're showing their appreciation, but that it's there. I think I just kind of talked about this one already. We do see differences in gestures and body language. There's, for example, delayed or reduced frequency of pointing as a communication tool. Showing, taking an object, holding it up, letting somebody else see it is something we see less of in this population, particularly when they're younger. And a social smile, which is just when you're walking by somebody in the hallway and you kind of smile at them and you just automatically smile back and you're like, that was kind of awkward. I wish I didn't, do that weird thing with my, right? We do that, but we do it so automatically. And sometimes that's not quite as automatic for folks on the spectrum. Okay, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here because I'm already talking about the gestures. But we may see unusual things like tone of voice, volume, rate of speech. We may see some of these markers, and I'm sure that Jackie will be able to talk much more in detail about some of those differences in speech and the things that they're going to be looking for. But those are some things that I'm watching for when someone comes into my office with the question of, does my child have autism? Am I noticing differences in the way that they talk, not just what they say or what they talk about, but how that speech comes out? Every once in a while, we get a kiddo that meets the description, and we call them internally distracted. Maybe they're laughing at things that are internal that they're not seeing in their environment or in a situation that I'm presenting. Maybe they're not laughing in situations where they normally would be. One of the key variables that sets autism apart from several other diagnoses that may affect things like social communication is this area of restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. Right? People with restricted interests tend to be either unusually interested in, they're interested in things that are unusual for their age. I've had 7-year-olds that can tell me all of the part numbers for every Hoover vacuum cleaner ever made. That's a pretty unusual area of interest. Not to say it isn't functional from time to time, certainly it can be helpful. I've had kids that know every word to every Grey Poupon commercial that was ever released in the 90s, things like that. It can be hyper-specific and rather unusual. We can also have kids who are interested in something that's age-appropriate or typical, but to an unusual degree. It's not unusual for a little kid to be interested in something like Thomas the Tank Engine. They might love that show, they may watch it as much as they can. However, if you can only wear your Thomas t-shirt, if you can only use your Thomas plates and spoons, if you can only watch Thomas and anything else that's on the TV makes you cry, That's probably a bit of an unusual degree to which they like that. I have had 13-year-olds dress up as Thomas the Tank Engine for Halloween. That doesn't really go over so well in middle school as it might have done when they were in elementary. We also see some sensory behaviors, and I won't spend much time on this, I don't think, because I think we could spend, again, the whole day talking specifically about sensory behaviors. But when you watch for different behaviors that are sensory-based, you might see things like visual inspection. They might be holding things just in the peripheral of vision or right in front of their vision. They may be wiggling their fingers. They may be dangling things. They may be dropping things. They may be doing different sorts of visual excitement and things to look at. You also will see people that tend to smell things or sniff. I've had lots of people that like to sniff hair, the smell of shampoo, things like that they really enjoy. I've seen people who are also very sensitive. This is another one of those where it can be either extreme. Either they're seeking out this sensory input all the time, or they're constantly looking for it, or they're working really hard to avoid it. And everybody in here has probably seen that particular move where they're covering their ears for a sound that doesn't bother other people. It's important to just take a minute to note, we've identified that these kids are not just being unusually sensitive. It's actually that their sensory experience, and we're not entirely neurologically sure why, but we do recognize that their sensory experience is more intense. We've all been in situations where we've had things like a fire alarm go off, and it's a piercing sound. It actually causes physical discomfort in your ear. Everybody's nodding, you know that sensation. Well, for a lot of these kids, their threshold for that pain and that discomfort is much lower. It's not that they're being whiny or they're being overly demanding. It's that it actually hurts them more than it would for some other people. Another thing that I'll watch for when I'm doing my diagnostic process is looking for strict patterns of routine, almost bordering on compulsions. It has to be done a certain way, in a certain order. You have to read the same book with the same inflections and the same tone in order for them to feel safe. Back in the 1940s, when Lee O'Connor first identified what later became known as autism spectrum disorder, one of the key features, the original 2 features that he identified, was what he called an obsessive need for sameness. Interestingly, we've come pretty much full circle, right? We've gone through all these evolutions of the diagnosis, and now we're really coming back to this idea. This is pretty fundamental. This is pretty important for a lot of these folks, that they're not actively seeking change. They really want things to be as static and as predictable as possible. I can get into all the reasons for that again another time, but I think that it's really interesting to think about how many of our kids' behaviors we can chalk up to this, what I would describe as an autistic need for sameness, or an obsessive need for sameness, where they really want things to be the same. Let's see. You might see them do this with toys, repetitive play with toys. They have to arrange them in a certain way. They have to line them up. They have to do certain things, and if you interfere with that play, it can become pretty distressing for them. I mentioned already the unusual interests, whether it's either unusual things or normal things to an unusual degree. And I also mentioned the sensory. I think that it's important to stop and think, as I know you guys are going to talk more specifically about behaviors later on today, but a disproportionate number of behavior problems that come into my office are resolved with strictly sensory interventions, just helping people get their sensory needs met in a way that doesn't involve the negative behavior. All right, and this is again the exact same point here. Many children exhibit unwanted behavior due to sensory deficits or needs. And I think that that's important to understand as we're thinking about what is causing the behavior that's causing us a problem. What are they seeking? One of my favorite lines that I heard from a college professor years and years and years ago was, every behavior is a solution to another problem you haven't seen. That's worth pausing and thinking about that one again. Every problematic behavior that you see is a solution to another behavior that you haven't stopped to think about or haven't noticed yet. And I think that that's a fascinating way to think about some of these differences, some of the behaviors that I'm not sure why he does that, or I never understood what that is. It's important to take some time and pause and think about what is driving this behavior. Is it a sensory need? Is it something that they actively need to feel comfortable? I once had an occupational therapist stop me and explain about a young man that I was having trouble. I was working in a classroom setting, and I could not keep this little guy in his seat. He was about 7 years old. He was all over the place, flopping all over the table, laying with his belly across the seat, all sorts of different body movements. And I said, I've tried everything. I've tried weighted blankets. I've tried reward schedules. I don't understand how to help this kiddo feel more comfortable in his chair. And this occupational therapist stopped me and said, can you imagine sitting on a bicycle seat? Okay, 30 feet in the air. Okay, with nothing to hold on to. With this kid's sense of proprioception, which is their awareness of their body and space, she said that's what sitting in a chair feels like to this kid. So all these things he's doing, I mean, that makes total sense. Laying down on those are all things I would see myself trying if I was in that precarious or uncomfortable of a position. And so she was able to help me arrange his seating in such a way that he really had a broader sense of stability and foundation. And sure enough, he was able to sit better. But very, very frequently, we may have to look beyond what we're looking at as problematic behavior and try and find that sensory component, see what's going on for them.